Hi, and welcome back to the Church Renewal Podcast. I'm your host, Alan Edwards, and today we're featuring a renewal story. In our Renewal Stories series, we bring to light the voices of pastors and ministry leaders on the front lines, renewing their city, renewing the ministries of local churches. And today we're happy to have Jeff Logdson on the program. Jeff's pastor in Arizona was recently featured in Gordon Penfold's book, Restart Churches. Podcast listeners will remember that we interviewed Gordon earlier this season, and he's got a great story about the nexus of church planting and the revitalization of a church that was at the end of its life cycle. So tune in to this episode, and afterwards share it with a friend. We'd love to magnify the voices of these stories of God doing really good and interesting work on the front lines of ministry. All right, let's dig into the ways that Jesus is renewing his church. All right, so we're so glad to welcome Jeff Logdson onto the Church Renewal Podcast today. Jeff left Southern California to work with a church planting team in Tucson, and 2 years ago, he launched Hope City Church in Tucson, out of a church that was in its kind of final season of ministry. It's important to Jeff to seek relationships with like-minded people in his city to move from impoverished communities to a thriving city of generosity. He was recently featured in Gordon Penfold's book, Restart Churches, and spoke at the Exponential Conference in Orlando, Florida in 2020. Podcast listeners will remember that we spoke with Gordon about his book earlier this season, and we are really happy to have Jeff on with us today to tell his story. Jeff, welcome to the Church Renewal Podcast.
Hey, thank you for having me.
Hey, we are so excited to have you, brother. So the story of your work in Tucson is really the story of replanting or restarting the kind of nexus of something new and something old crossing paths and something beautiful happening out of that. But let's back up a little bit and tell me what drew you to Tucson and what was it that God was calling you to when you first came into that city?
There's an irony in the question because I had always told God I would never come to Tucson. My family is here. I think the thing that has drawn me is my parents and my wife's parents are here now, and in their season of retirement, it was important to my wife and I to be able to have our children next to their grandparents. We would visit here at Christmas time and in the summer. I think it was especially the time during the summer that compelled us never to want to move here. And without maybe getting into this story in detail, I will tell you we were at a homeless outreach event in Southern California that I had been a part of for a number of years. It was a year like the years before, with the exception that one of my previous employers from when I was 15 years of age, I'm 47 now, shows up at this homeless outreach event. And it caught me by surprise. I said, Lisa, what are you doing here? And she said, I feel like God has led me here to tell you something. And I said, that's bizarre, but what's on your mind? And after talking for a little bit, we were in a season of soul searching. What's next? Not sure about what that looked like. And it was like the dome of silence from Get Smart had set on the environment that we were in. And she said the words, I think God is going to move you to Tucson. And my wife's in tears, and I'm like, I don't think so. And in the months to follow, it was just like everything came into place where we found ourselves in Tucson. I will say this one thing, and it's kind of maybe not everyone's experience, but it was a confirmation because the road here has been so rough, but we knew we were called here. And so there was never any question. But following Lisa's statement, I think you're going to be moving to Tucson. I said, Lord, if you want us to move to Tucson, I need you to give my pastor a dream because I can't go apart from his blessing. And we sat in his office several months after that period of time. And he said, Jeff, how is ministry going? And I said, it's good, but I'm not sure I'm where I'm supposed to be. And I can't explain it. And he said, I had a dream you were going to Tucson. And totally unprecipitated, but he shared those words and then backpedaled. And I said, you don't have to backpedal. God's already revealed it to us. I was just afraid to ask you because I didn't have your blessing. And he looked at me in his office, sitting across the coffee table, and he said, Jeff, I want to bless you. And that's what led us here.
Wow, that is beautiful. I think one of the hardest things in church life and ministry is letting go. If you've got a great volunteer, a great team member, and and sending them off. I mean, but I mean, isn't that exactly what Jesus did, right? He had his 12 and he sent them. I mean, and the world is blessed by it.
The spirit, and I have a strong conviction in this, but the spirit with which we leave a ministry is the same spirit that becomes that seed that plants the next ministry. And so we didn't want to leave apart from his blessings. Since we've been in Tucson, I've met people from other parts of the country that have moved here. They sat with their pastor and said, I feel called to lead a church. And because of their gender or what have you, their previous pastor and mentor said, I won't get behind you in this work that God is doing. And it breaks my heart, but you talk about, I mean, you're foreshadowing with that conversation about a city of generosity. Part of that for me is wherever God is at work, we want to join him in that work. And so when people come to Tucson looking to see the kingdom of God grow, we want to help. We want to bless.
Yeah. So you had a background and a connection and a heart for the work of church planting. We often say that there are similar characteristics between guys who can maintain a church and who can lead change in an existing church. And then there are similar characteristics between the guys who turn around an existing church and guys who plant. It's almost like a spectrum or a continuum. What do you think are some of the overlapping characteristics or skills or whatever between the kind of guys God uses to plant a new work and the kind of folks God tends to use to turn around an existing situation? Do you feel like you see any of those because you've kind of swam in both waters a little bit?
Yeah, I think it's a powerful question, and I honestly have not thought about it. For me, so I have worked with a church planning coach, and that has been important just to help keep me on track. We can't work inside of a vacuum. I think it's important to surround ourselves with people who see things objectively, that wise counsel. But I think there's a certain sense of intuitiveness to be able to understand the culture or the context, the landscape, what's currently happening in that particular environment. I think looking at what was in the space that we're now in, part of the questions that I asked had to do with what things are working well, because not everything has to die. In that particular context for us, it meant the church was a prayerful church. That's an important piece that was already there. The church was a great steward of its resources, so we didn't inherit debt at all. The current location was strategically placed within the city that we're surrounded by. Those were strengths that I could see. And then the flip side of that is, what are the opportunities that are there to be able to leverage? Now, in our case, one of the opportunities was viewed as a weakness by the previous pastor that was here and I would even add the previous church that was here. The comment was made, we don't want to invest in the immediate community because they don't have any money. And it was a piercing response, because in my mind, I knew God's not a respecter of persons. What they have or don't have is not important to him as much as the heart of the people turning back to him. And so what we saw was a community that desperately needed to experience the love of Jesus. And because they desperately needed to experience that, God was going to make a way financially. And so the thing that was a deterrent from the previous church, the poverty of the existing community, I felt was a strength, because it was a group of people that God wanted to reach. He just wanted to know who was willing to reach them.
Yeah.
So, I'm trying to summarize for you, what are the strengths that are currently there? What are the opportunities that could be seen? A certain degree of intuitiveness, maybe, to understand that, but also, if a person doesn't have that insight or discernment, are there people, men and women, of wisdom that could help speak into that situation?
Yeah. I like that you said intuitiveness about the culture of the place. So in a minute, I'd love for you to tell our listeners how it came to be that a church plant ended up kind of overtaking an existing church that was at the end of its life cycle. But before we get there, I think you've hit on something that one of our coaches at Flourish, Wes White, a word he gave to us a few years ago was the word curiosity. I think one of the key characteristics that a church planter and that a renewal revitalization leader has in common is a curiosity about the community. In established churches that are just used to things being steady and normal, I think it's easy to lose your curiosity. But when you're a planter, you go into a place, even if you're planting in a place you have to stay curious.
Sure.
And if you want to revitalize a church or turn a church around, you have to help that church become curious about the culture. You said an intuition about the culture, but just that sense of we need to know and study and understand who is it that God has given us to minister to, you know?
I'll tell you a great story about that. I mean, part of the community we minister is to the homeless. We live in, and this is fascinating, but we live in a very transient stretch of property where there's an alley between a porn shop and a recycling center, and so by virtue of what's around us, it lends itself to a highway for those who are homeless. And I've had them sit in my office and just just ask them questions, which I think was probably as weird for them. But I said, if I gave you $5, what could you get with that $5 here in the neighborhood? And the comment that surprised me was, hey, Jeff, what you don't understand is when the sun goes down right across the street, it's Madison Square Garden, and the drug activity, you can get anything you want for $5. And how easy is it for us just to hand $5 to someone who's in need, thinking we're helping them, but we're really perpetuating a problem?
Yeah.
It's the curiosity that lends itself to the question to really understand how we're helping or how we're hurting an existing dynamic.
Yeah. So to talk more about that neighborhood that y'all are ministering in, at some point in your journey in Tucson, you kind of zeroed in on this place and seeing a new work birthed by God in this place, Hope City Church. And at the same time, you were using the offices of an existing church that was in what we might charitably call the end of its life cycle. The pastor was kind of struggling with energy and had some health issues. Can you just tell us a little bit about how did a church plant kind of cross paths with this existing church, and what was born out of that?
I think initially when the invitation was made to come and be a part, my first desire was to honor the people who were here and to see if there was any way to revitalize that. I think after a year, several, tens of thousands of dollars invested, funds raised, new life coming, it was apparent that we weren't going to be able to turn it around. And it was unfortunate, but we brought in someone from the outside, the director of the association, to sit with the board and to say, hey, look, and this was the hard truth. It was one of two options. You could either hang on to what you got and write it into the ground and nothing will come from that, or you can turn it over to this church planner, myself, and birth something new. And so first and foremost, we tried to honor what was and see if we could revitalize what was there, but it wasn't possible, unfortunately. I'm glad that they blessed us with the opportunity to start something new. And in that, I think led to the connection with one of your former interviewers, Gordon Penfold, in a book that he wrote that led us to, I think, 7 insights to be able to assess how the new work was not going to be, I use the word infected, and I think it's kind of a strong word, but I think that picture of infection, you don't want the new birth to be reminiscent of what was before. It has to be its own thing and stand on its own, and the community has to see it as something new if it's going to be given a chance.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like I grow tomatoes in my backyard, and if I pick a bunch of tomatoes and one of them has a bunch of rot in it, if I leave it in the bin with all my other good tomatoes, that rot, that mold, it's going to spread. And so without casting aspersion or casting blame, what were those cultural things from the old church that you were really trying to guard against coming into the new work? If you can maybe highlight one or two of those.
One specifically was the desire not to want to interact with the immediate community, which was
Mhm.
heartbreaking because the immediate community, it was impoverished, it's struggling. Uh, but they just didn't. We have our Bible study, and we don't want them to be a part of it. So there was a distinct separation from the community.
Mhm.
If you reached out to the community at large and said, "What is your awareness of this church that is in this space?" It was hard for anyone in the immediate surrounding to know anything about the church because of that separation. So it didn't necessarily have an impact in the community. Um, so the separation from its surroundings and the desire not to want to allow new life to come in were two real challenges.
Yeah. So when you talk about the community that God has called you to, you've mentioned before that there are some significant economic challenges in that community. I imagine that brings with it some significant social challenges. Um, we often say that for a church to be renewed and revitalized, there has to be this this curiosity to know the place and to be a particular people in a particular place. And it sounds like for you all in the particular place you're in, fulfilling the mission of Jesus means in this place really entering into that. And I imagine that's what gives birth to this concept, seeing Tucson become a city of generosity. What is that sound seems like it's something pretty core to your mission. What do you mean by that? And how is Tucson becoming a city of generosity? How does that intersect with the mission of Jesus to advance his kingdom?
There was an interesting parallel alongside of the opportunity to birth the church on 22nd near Craycroft. And that was when we first arrived here, not knowing where we were going to plant. I immediately joined a local chamber of commerce, not as a pastor, but as an entrepreneur and a business person. That relationship opened doors with the mayor of Tucson, the former mayor. That relationship with the mayor through the local chamber, when it became apparent that Hope City was going to be the place of this new church, created a bridge for me to sit with the mayor and to say, hey, look, I'm here to serve you. What are the immediate needs of that 22nd Street corridor? And the mayor, he'd been there for a long time, and he told me immediately, Jeff, your neighborhood struggles with 5 things, and the Tucson Police Department will tell you door to door what each of those struggles are. It begins first and foremost with domestic violence. It's addiction, drug addiction, it's prostitution, it's welfare checks for seniors and children alike living in unsafe living conditions, and then robbery. Those are the 5 things that your immediate community struggles with. And those were the things that we said, hey, look, we want to be a part of helping solve that problem. So today, one church in and of itself is not going to create a city of generosity. And that's not to downplay or disregard the power of God and his Holy Spirit in the community. It's to say that the church is not intended to function autonomously. And so
Right.
for us, we've linked arms by the grace of God. There are 10 different church partners that we have throughout the city that invest in us, not just monetarily, but also physically. They come and they serve. And then we have 15 community partners that partner with us to help revitalize what God is doing throughout the 22nd Street corridor. So our second year, we just celebrated on Sunday, August 9th. And we had a video montage. Some of those videos are captured on our website at hopecitychurchtucson.com. But there's these video montages of those partners just saying, hey, happy birthday, Hope City. Thank you for what you're doing in the community. But it's been a partnership. And prior to our coming here, there was a stigma that I wasn't aware of, but I quickly learned churches north of a certain boundary line did not help churches south of a certain boundary line in our city. And it wasn't because they didn't want to. It was there was this natural separation between affluence and poverty throughout the community. Tucson, if you're not familiar with this, is the 5th most impoverished metropolitan U.S. city. That stat is pre-COVID, so I don't know what that looks like now.
Yeah.
But because of the poverty and because of the absence of the connection between the community and the local church, there is both a physical need and a spiritual need that God, I think, has done a great job of addressing through the openness of the local church to meet that need.
Great. Well, thanks for sharing that, Jeff. That vision for seeing the kingdom of Jesus come to bear on a community like the Israelites in the Babylonian captivity, to seek the good of the city, is an encouraging message. And if you're cool with it, I'd like to kind of finish on this question. They say that one of the nice things about planting a church is that you really get to shape the culture early on. It's one of the things you don't get to do when you're coming into an existing church. And you kind of have experienced this nexus of the two with the legacy church gifting. And I don't know if you have some of the people from the legacy church that have continued on with Hope City Church. But when it comes to helping people in the church, in an existing church, recapture that mindset that you're describing, the mindset of a missionary to a place, do you have any wisdom or counsel or word from the Lord on how pastors and lay leaders in their churches can help existing congregations capture this mindset that you're describing that is kind of just in the DNA of Hope City Church, this mindset of we have neighbors right outside the door, and that's who Jesus has called us to minister to. So we need to understand what are the needs in this community. Can you give me some counsel? Can you give our listeners some counsel on how do we help people in the pews today recapture that mindset?
I think one of the first things that comes to mind is a prayerful approach to what is it that God is doing in the surrounding community. So outside of the walls of the church, apart from our sacred cows or those things that have seemingly become important to us or central to what we consider the mission to be, what is God doing in the immediate community? Where is he blessing? What are the challenges that are breaking his heart? Domestic violence, obviously, is one of those things that God would want to see change. So what organizations are out there addressing domestic violence? How could we build bridges with the local police department to understand this issue of domestic violence in our backyard? Having the church prayerfully listen to the things where God is already at work. My church planning coach, friend, mentor said, success is finding out what God is already doing and just joining him in that work. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's a piece of it that I would start with. I think the other thing that is important is there are inherently in established churches a group of stakeholders where the decisions begin and end with. And I think it's important to break that up and to invite new people to that table, or maybe even start a different table where people have the freedom to be able to share ideas, where they're truly listened to and their ideas embraced, to be able to break up that ground, to forge new paths forward, to speak into the life of what God's doing in the community.
So prayerfully listen to what God is doing and join him, and invite people to the table to break up the ground for fertility, for new fruit in the gospel. That's good counsel, Jeff. Jeff, thank you so much for sharing with us today. If folks want to connect with what you're doing in Tucson, they can reach out to you right through Hope City Church Tucson, hopecitychurchtucsonaltogether.com. Are there other ways folks can connect with you and the work God is doing there in Hope City?
Yeah, if you want to send me an email, Jeff A. Logdson, Logsdon @gmail.com.
Jeff A. Logdson, Logsdon @gmail.com. Reach out to Jeff if you want to learn more about creating cities of generosity, if you want to understand the ways that God is calling them to be missionaries there at Hope City Church. Jeff, thanks so much for joining us on the podcast today. It's been great to have you, brother.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And to our listeners, it's been a great episode of the Church Renewal Podcast. We love hearing the stories of what God is doing on the ground in leading renewal in the lives and the ministry of his churches. The Church Renewal Podcast is a ministry of Flourish Coaching. You can always find us at flourishcoaching.org. I'm your host, Alan Edwards. You can get me at Alan, ALLAN, at flourishcoaching.org by email. You know, there's only one fully sufficient reason that this day dawned, and it is that Jesus is yet gathering a people to himself, and the ordinary way he does that is through the work of the church. So join us next time as we dig into the ways that Jesus is renewing his church.